considering we were a minority, I tried to find, low-hanging fruit, if you will, that were bipartisan bills. So I focused on veteran-related matters. I had two bills. One was in regards to a green alert bill, which part of the process for me was learning as I put it in. But what it is, other states already have this active. It is a recognition system for people that have PTSD or mental disorders from serving in the service. And what it does is it enacts, or it gets the DOJ to work with the localities on helping those people if they fall off the radar, if you will. So unfortunately, the chairman wasn't comfortable with the DOJ. In fact, the question was, is the DOJ federal or state? And my understanding is the DOJ is federal, but that bill was tabled to further study that matter. The second veterans-related bill that I put into play was actually a bill that came from last session, from a Democrat. It was for permanently disabled veterans that were below the poverty line in terms of income. It was to give them a tax break. That got all the way to Senate Appropriations, and the JLC worked with me on that. Little did I know that it was under study from last session, but unfortunately the study never actually was enacted. So hopefully this time the study will kick in and we'll be able to push it for next session. I did try my third attempt, if you will, which 3 strikes you're out, was for faith-based community. Considering the vaccines weren't 100% vetted by the FDA. I know they were emergency driven, but by law and how the FDA works, they weren't completely vetted vaccines. So I was trying to help the faith-based organizations to make sure that they were not mandated to the public. So that unfortunately fell on the sword in the subcommittee. But as part of that process, I must say that, that in itself, what I experienced, and just I would go down to Richmond 3 or 4 days a week, and I would work with the delegates, as I was telling Wendy earlier, just trying to learn and absorb and take in how everybody does this, because on virtual it's almost impossible not to really get all sides of how you do this. So fortunately, I would learn from them, and my aide would work with their aides, and we would kind of learn by fire, if you will. But being in a minority, it was challenging, to say the least, but we gave it a good go, and certainly I learned a lot of things that I will, the next time we'll try to have a better batting average. So thank you.
Thank you. Delegate LaRoque.
Thanks for having me here. It's always a pleasure. Privilege to preface. So the question is, what did I do that maybe at least attempted to make a difference?
There you go.
Very good. Well, I'll kind of cue off one of the questions that related to executive powers. I think that clearly this whole pandemic has left virtually no aspect of life untouched. Very, very profound effect on things like schools and doing business in Virginia. And perhaps, hopefully we'll never see another situation that has government to the extent that this pandemic has. So I'm not quiet about my dissatisfaction with how the pandemic was managed. Certainly the government didn't cause the virus, at least that we know of, and at least not our government. And but I think we certainly compounded. We, the government of Virginia, perhaps the government of the United States, really missed the opportunity to have the sort of influence that government should have. It's not a place to be taking sweeping actions to wipe away very fundamental rights, such as freedom of religion, freedom of a business to operate, to function, once particularly small businesses. And our emergency powers laws that empower the governor to take swift action in cooperation with the Commissioner of Health were clearly never intended to allow him to have scope and orders of the duration that he has chosen to enact. So I think that puts us in a position where much of the aftermath here, which I assume we're on the downside of things moving in the right direction, is government fixing problems that it magnified significantly. So while it may sound good to some to have our money given back to us, whether it's money from the federal government or our state coffers, basically it's government to a large degree fixing or sort of trying to negate the effects of a problem that it caused to a large degree. Again, not the pandemic itself, but the effects that were imposed on people. It drove vast numbers of people into unemployment lines that were months long. People were told that they were going to receive benefits, but we had an antiquated system that was completely unprepared to deal with the surge in unemployment. I think there were 8 million Virginians waiting for unemployment at one point in time. DMV is never anybody's favorite way to spend a couple hours. Now I hear people driving from one side of the state to the other because the restrictions that were imposed largely under the advice of a pseudo expert who stood to profit from a pandemic that as it expanded in scope, he profited more. That's not the type of advisor that we would look to. So again, differing views on how things would have turned out better had they been handled differently. But I think I see government's place as supporting and propping up private individuals and private businesses. And I'll just, instead of just criticizing, I'll say in a more perfect world, instead of drive-throughs where they stick a swab halfway up into your brain, people might have picked up a Ziploc baggie with some hydroxychloroquine or ibuprofen. I always want to say ibuprofen, but the sort of in zinc. It's pretty widely known that if people's immune system is bolstered and strong and ready, that's part of the difference why some people have something closer to a common cold and other people die from it. Now, granted, our physiologies are all different, but locking things down, keeping kids out of school, which triggered all sorts of residual negative effects such as depression, suicide, and drug use and domestic abuse. Ignoring all of those things when making the important decisions that the governor made is very, very short-sighted, and that is government at its worst. So in a more perfect world, the governor would have recognized that the emergency powers that exist were meant to have a duration of maybe a week to 10 days. If a tidal wave is coming or a severe storm is coming off the coast, as we see once in a while, and he needed to make some serious decisions, he has that power. But we're way beyond a year, and the legislature has never been called back to deal with problems and to participate in the decision-making process where basically laws are ignored, new laws are put into effect, and that's a process that the legislature should have been fully engaged in. I don't think that the Health Commission has even actually participated in the decisions that should have been an advisory role supporting the Commissioner of Health. So it basically is one, maybe two men if you count the Commissioner of Health, running the state with a very heavy hand. So different people would mark the results and the outcomes differently. I would say that in the future, I had a bill that I thought took a very comprehensive approach to suggesting that an emergency be dealt with in a manner that involved the legislature, considered metrics and scientific data, was least restrictive, involved transparency, brought in public input, and would be dealt with in a manner that did not have the scope and the impact that we saw, are still seeing, and will be impacting for years to come, particularly in areas of education where many students effectively lost a year of education. So I'll limit it there. Perhaps there are other questions that people are curious about what could have been done differently. And thanks for the opportunity to lay that out. I certainly think that's something that is affecting the business community And I'm glad to elaborate if you'd like.
So maybe just 2 minutes quickly each. What is any topics that are still going to be addressed in the next session that lay near to your heart?
Well, I think one of my favorite bills this session was getting health and safety protections for domestic workers. I lost both my parents last May within 19 days of each other. And even though it was a time of COVID, my parents died peacefully at home, no COVID, and in a beautifully kept and cleaned house and meals beautifully prepared, and women who even cut their hair and trimmed his beard, and just these wonderful, wonderful healthcare, home healthcare workers. And I will never lose those women. They are now, I consider them family, and I stay in touch with them all the time. But it was eye-opening to me to see what they need, and they have rights and needs as we all do. So I'm going to continue to fight hard. The part that did not go through was getting these not healthcare workers, but the domestic workers on workman's comp. That part failed. It's expensive, but I don't see why my neighbor, a tech worker, is perfectly qualified for workman's comp where a domestic worker is not. And so that's something I'm going to continue to work on. We have to make strides in raising teacher pay. We did that this session, and our Winchester superintendent just informed me that Winchester was able to do the match so the Winchester teachers will get a 5% pay raise. I think, we're in a well-to-do area, so the teachers will get that, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what teachers make in other states. And if you look at, there's been a recent study, a national study, that says that Virginia is way, way down there in a teacher's average salary compared to average salaries in other industries as compared to other states. So we have a lot of work to do there. And we put such a burden on our teachers this year, and they really deserve it. We need them, and there's a shortage.
Oh, good, Wiley.
Thank you. So, when I started as a delegate, I met with a lot of the locality folks, and certainly our constituents. And, we're elected to promote opportunities and or defend situations for our constituents in Richmond. That's how we're elected. And so, a lot of, the message that's being sent from the constituents of the 29th district, is about, keeping gun policies in check. The legislation right now with the gun policy has gotten way out of control, and we need to keep that in check. And I think we need to focus more on the mental health aspects. There is a cost there, but I think with part of that, people understand that that's the driving issue. It's not the tool, it's the mental health issue. So that's one area that I'd like to focus on. And I think we can get bipartisan agreement on that moving forward throughout the state. The second, and these are all not in order, of course, they all kind of run concurrent in terms of priority to me, is the economy in terms of our locality. I have a great concern for the unions trying to get their nose, the proverbial camel's nose in front of the tent into the state of Virginia. It's already in play. There were many bills, in fact, the marijuana bill yesterday, that had union language in it. It's prevalent in many bills that I saw that came across my table. I'm very concerned about that. Many industries in this area are here for a reason. One is logistics, and two is because it's a right to work state. We have unions in this state, I can guarantee you, it will have a major impact in our area. And then the third thing is just trying to find ways that we can work with localities, as I mentioned in the beginning, those priorities that they need to help make the community better. I think Yeah, I was probably one of the very few Republicans that voted for the blighted properties. I can't remember the actual bill name and number, but it spoke to helping out communities with blighted properties. And I know that the city of Winchester, from my experience on city council, has major issues with trying to promote properties that are blighted. So there was a bill there to help them to promote and better the community. So I was proud to get that passed. But that being said, that's going to be my mission. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Please,
Just, if I get the
go right ahead.
or just cut me off. Yeah, so I think that I would characterize the last two sessions, well, 2 years, which included a variety of special sessions, as Republicans doing their best to be a firewall, to throw ourselves in between the Democrat-dominated wrecking ball, or at least to slow it down at any opportunity we had. But they hung together, and the number of bills that were what I would consider, and I'm expecting to agree, are not business friendly, very anti-business, is going to take some years to undo. And so that is going to really dominate, I think, efforts that we have cut out for us, Lord willing, when we retake the governor's mansion and the House of Delegates. I'm amazed that Delegate Gudaitis would bring up domestic workers. One of the bills that she patroned that absolutely amazes me is that if you want to bring a domestic worker into your home, or what previous would now be classified as a domestic worker would be a babysitter, a tutor, to work a couple hours a week, then if you make a mistake and have a preference, be known that you want your child's babysitter to be a female, or that you want a home care worker to bathe and dress your elderly mother, if you let that be known that you have preferences to the sex of that person, then you can have the Attorney General bring in a team to investigate your home, or excuse me, to bring a cause of action against you, to have your home not searched, but to be, have state employees come into your home and examine the premises. These are the kind of bills that we're going to have our hands full walking them backwards. There's just any number of things that employers should have the ability to consider when they're hiring employees. We're going to have to be on the lookout for the ongoing effort to abolish right to work. That crept into this marijuana bill. So, we've got kids that are at home, not enough to do, suffering from depression, and the priority does not seem to be opening schools. It is to legalize marijuana. That took place, finalized yesterday. Not moving things in the right direction. So, I'd like to be promoting good things like school choice, which provide a variety of educational alternatives that have never been more necessary. And the need has been demonstrated when public schools just chose not to function. And yet still very little funding, if any, is allowed to make its way into the hands of parents who would choose an alternative. So that's a positive initiative that I look forward to championing. We've twice sent that to the governor, vetoed by Governor McAuliffe, once vetoed by Governor Northam when he was the president of the Senate. And it's one of the things that I really think would benefit our communities and help kids get a better education. So I'll end on a positive note. Thank you.
Speaking about marijuana, marijuana was just legalized, as we all know, today big in the newspaper, 3 years earlier than originally opposed to in February. So the question is a couple questions together, and I know we could drag this out to a very long time, and I don't want to because I have a lot of questions here. What education or what market studies were reviewed to even say yay or nay to this bill? What measurable levels do we have? And this strictly from a business perspective, what measurable levels do we have to say that that person can still operate equipment, is not under a DUI? who's paying for the equipment to measure this, all this stuff? I know it's a little bit broad and I don't want to keep it, I don't want to drag it out. So everybody, maybe just 3 minutes on this topic so we can get to the other questions.
I first just want to say that apparently my mic wasn't working and my whole first thing about business. So what I would say to people, anyone watching, if you would contact my office, I would be very happy to provide that list. And apparently it has now been fixed. In terms of marijuana, so education, there's education money put by for kids. Schools already educate. There will be more money for further education. To my mind, you know, we have cigarettes, we have alcohol, and now we have marijuana, things that we keep away from kids, things that kids can't have direct contact with. And that's, to my mind, it's not that big a step. There's also money put by to train 40 individuals in law enforcement to become the specialists. And I wish I could articulate details, but it's not something I'm an expert on. But there will be law enforcement experts educated, trained around the state to help with exactly those issues. I will say frankly, legalization of marijuana is not my favorite thing, but I was convinced ultimately because of the racial inequities of how it is prosecuted, and how arrests are made and how it is prosecuted. And really they are huge. The inequities are huge. And because of the dangerous market as it is now, where it can be laced and is laced with fentanyl and other things to create more addiction, stronger addiction. So for me, that was why I went there. It's definitely not my favorite, but frankly, alcohol isn't either. I lost a brother to alcoholism, and the CSBs will tell us that alcohol is the biggest problem. So we're trying, because marijuana is out there, because there's dangerous marijuana out there, we are trying to go forward in a way that regulates it.
Delegate Wiley.
Yeah, so yesterday with this legislation, part of this bill, which is rather lengthy, you asked about the study. I can't speak to the study that promoted the reason why you have legalization for marijuana. But what I can say is that from our caucus, from what we found from Colorado's experience through their process, is that it is having drastic effects on the youth. It's causing more issues from a law enforcement standpoint and from the legalization standpoint of keeping it in check. I had a question on the floor yesterday, and it was a simple question to the patron about how does one get the seeds or the use of marijuana legally to plant the 4 plants that you would have legally in your house? And the answer was, the precedent has been set, so therefore that's the answer I got. I still don't understand that answer, but I still don't understand how you can get it legal to plant your plants. So maybe that answer just gets put under the rug. But that being said, the concerns we have from what's going on in Colorado and other states, I think that from this bill, we kind of pushed this bill too fast. I think we threw it in play a lot faster than getting the answers we needed to make this happen and make it work right. It was a haphazard bill, if you will. There was a lot of holes in it, and very concerned about the law enforcement side. She mentioned that we have 40 specialists that are going to be involved. There's $1 million in play there. That's just, that's dropping the bucket for the amount of law enforcement that needs to be directed to this. And this latter part of that is the enforcement of it. How do you enforce that? I still don't understand how we can do that when you pull somebody over and how you go through the process of detecting and seeing if that person's high or how that works. We still don't have any clue, but yet we went ahead and rammed this bill through, and there's no accountability to keep it in check. So this bill to me was just rushed and wasn't put together the way it should have been done. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a biggie. So after July 1st, you'll be able to stand on the corner and look around you. I think Senator Norman said he visited Colorado one day and looked around on the street corner, and on 3 of the 4 street corners he was at an intersection, there were people puffing on marijuana. Now, is that bad? I guess, clearly it was up to the legislature to decide. My mind goes in 2 different directions. I have a daughter that is sort of libertarian thinking on some things, and she always wants to talk about, well, we allow alcohol and drugs, cigarettes to be legal. Why not marijuana? And that's certainly a valid question. And then there's also the practical effects, the burdens that will be placed on society in general when people are negatively impacted and enter the mental health system, the hospitals, the workforce, or drive on highways. And clearly, in my thinking, anytime we do limit something from the public, we need to have a reasonable justification at very least. So I'm kind of with my daughter in a general sense, but when I weigh up, I appreciate her position, just using her to illustrate that. But in the balance of the consideration, I think it's a terrible, terrible decision. It seems that you can find studies to justify either position, but some of the things that caught my attention are when you compare marijuana use to alcohol. Alcohol is addictive in nature, but nowhere near comparable to seeming what I consider to be credibly documented cases of decline in mental health in individuals. So again, we're already, I think, in a perilous situation with so many kids in a challenged situation, and then offering them this new pastime, which would be to hang around and stay intoxicated on marijuana. Cigarettes, very harmful, but we all know that that takes the damages of cigarettes take many years to present themselves, and so there's time to correct if one chooses to smoke and then move away from it. So that's a good thing. But again, I think the harms that are associated with marijuana aren't necessarily delayed like that. They're also very hard to detect. And that there was extensive discussion in the legislature on this bill because it's very widely acknowledged that there's going to be an uptick in driving while intoxicated on marijuana. And somebody did the back of the envelope math on $1 million in statewide law enforcement. It's about $40 to $50 per law enforcement. That's about the cost of the chamber breakfast here. Now, how much training are you going to get with $40? You might have a few experts sitting somewhere, but that's going to be absolutely next to worthless because you're going to need officers on the ground who can, do their best to detect something that's virtually undetectable, unless you take a blood sample, and I believe that takes a court action. So we're really kind of putting ourselves in a really difficult position there. I think that there's going to be a lot of consequences that are very negative. Particularly of interest to the business community is you got to fill jobs with people who aren't testing positive for marijuana. Now, you can go home and drink a couple of drinks at night and come in completely ready to work in the morning, but your insurance companies don't want to have people on the job testing positive for marijuana. Am I right? Is that kind of generally how it works? And by the way, they'll be breaking a federal law if they do that, which isn't going to go over too well on a couple different levels. So I think hasty is clearly an understatement. And unfortunately, what may appeal to some young people, and I recognize that is we ought to be making decisions like adults. And if there are problems with an imbalance in incarceration or a need for education, we shouldn't be starting the education process on the same day that the money, or excuse me, that the marijuana becomes legal and kids start using it. That's very short-sighted. So again, we're kind of in a position where we passed the bill. We're going to find out what happens. And I wish I could be a little more optimistic about that, but that's what we have.
Delegate LaRocque, I have a question for you. This was through executive order, I believe. It was changed from February, that it wasn't originally going to be voted on in 2024, which would have given everybody ample time to study it and figure different things out. Same with the declared pandemic with through executive order. How do we safeguard Virginians from executive orders?
Just a little adjustment to what you said. So the executive order certainly does apply to how the pandemic was dealt with. The marijuana bill was developed, I'm told, with much deliberation, and the conclusion as it left the House and Senate was the decision was to put in place a complete and comprehensive regulatory structure and have it go into effect in 2024. That wasn't soon enough for the governor. He considered this to be a hurry up, needed to be hurried up. So he sent back an amendment in the nature of a substitute. So I think it was 300-page rewrite of all the work product that left the legislature and said, this is the way we'll do it. So, sign here or you may get nothing. Sort of, now whether that was part of a big plan overall, I don't know. But that technically was an amendment in the nature of a substitute to what left the legislature. And so very much reflecting the preferences of the governor. But the executive order, help me with the question that related to the executive. What can we do to
safeguard the Virginians from executive orders?
Yeah, well, there are various states that take different approaches to executive orders, and I've kind of talked that through for the most part. They just need to be dealt with in a way that deliberates thoughtfully on the effects that are going to be had. And so clearly, when I saw the first executive order, I thought, he can't do that. And I looked it up and I realized that under power that is actually, it interconnects the Commissioner of Health in the case of a declared health emergency, empowering the governor, debatable as to what extent, but they chose to really stretch it to limits that I think were never intended. So what we can do is take what is a very loosely worded and sort of not very well defined law and flesh that out and make it very clear what the time constraints are, what the processes are that would deal with, heaven forbid, if we ever had an emergency along the lines of what we're experiencing now. The legislature should be the primary decision maker. It's lots of people, lots of ideas, lots of thoughts and opinions coming together, representing different interests to safeguard the interest of the Commonwealth overall and not one individual. So we need to change the law so that it's very clear that for a narrow period of time, the governor needs to have the ability to, I think it's referred to as meeting exigency, not a word I often use, but to me that says making a quick and emergency decision and then limiting that, perhaps making provisions for an extension if certain conditions are met, but having a law that is precisely defines what those powers are and what the legislature should do if we go beyond that point.
So a couple of questions here from the floor. Why was healthy living in therapeutics not pushed? That was Bill 21-72.
Can you say that again, sir?
The bill number is. Okay, sorry about that. Why wasn't healthy living in therapeutics not pushed?
Healthy living in what?
Therapeutics. It's not an issue I'm familiar with. I would love to talk to someone, and if there's a legislative idea that we can help with, I would be very glad to work on that with someone. I want to make a quick comforting statement, hopefully to people. There's a section in the marijuana bill that prohibits any person from consuming marijuana or any marijuana product or offering any of those to another in any public place. So that's taken care of in the bill. And I also wanted to say, in terms of executive orders, there is a reason that Virginia is 43rd on the list of states with the number of cases per 100,000 people. That means that we're 7th best in the country at managing this pandemic. And for a state of this population and this size, there was a reason for those executive orders, and they have been working well. And cases in our health district are 12% up in the last week. This is not over, and the variants are even more dangerous. So there are reasons for these orders.
Then I'll leave that one.
Do you guys have an answer for that?
Therapeutics.
Yes, go ahead.
Bert on that one. I didn't get any.
Yeah, well, probably the closest that I saw come to therapeutics was a resolution that I put forward. And I was very pleased with it. It was a collaborative effort. A lot of people that know of the benefits of hydroxychloroquine as a therapeutic, not a cure for COVID-19, but as a way to enhance the body's own immune system. We quoted, for example, Harvey Rich, I think is his name, chief epidemiologist at Stanford University. He actually called and commended us on the bill, on the resolution. Resolutions don't have the force of law, but it acknowledged the need for the government to get out of the way. So you have the potential for a therapeutic to help bolster people's resistance to this virus. And what does the governor of Virginia do in cooperation with the health commissioner? He effectively bans the use of a drug that has been around for 65 years, that the FDA has approved for nursing mothers, low cost, readily available. Now, who comes out ahead in that transaction? I've got to say, if anything could possibly wake me up to the scope and the reach of the influence of big pharma, that was it. So you have a readily available, low cost, prophylactic drug, safe as any drug could be, I think, probably safer than aspirin. And the government bans it, promotes fear of what's coming, a lot of bad information, controls all the metrics of testing and so on, instead of helping us get healthier. So they don't mind banning plastic bags and straws and all that. But as far as actually promoting good information, I have to say, it's money. That's the only conclusion that I could come to, and that is that the scope and the reach of big pharma, it is so big. There's nothing more heavily lobbied in Virginia than healthcare. Now, big pharma and healthcare are not the same, but I believe that that's the closest I could come to an answer. Some people wanted an expensive vaccine to be promoted. You have 3 different variations. Again, as Bill said, I think none of them FDA approved, no liability associated with it whatsoever. There is a fund that's very hard to tap into for vaccine injuries and so on. So who comes out ahead? I would say the manufacturers of the vaccine and politicians such as our governor, who crave the power to control the state apart from the legislature. Sounds conspiratorial, but I'm convinced that that's what it is.
Next question. Was there any further movement that would allow associations to provide group health insurance in Virginia? Delegate United.
As far as I know, those bills
did not make it out of committee. And the reason for that is because of affordable care, the ACA. The more people that are in the ACA pool, the lower those insurance costs are. Now I know insurance costs are not low, and we have to keep working on that in this, certainly in this Commonwealth, but in this nation, we have to work on healthcare for everybody. We know this. But the reason that those group plans don't make it out is in order to try to keep costs lower across the board so that you aren't pulling the healthier people, the working people out and leaving the ACA to just cover the people who have pre-existing or serious conditions. And that's the reason for that.
Across the board. I just want to say that there was one for the Realtors Association. I think that was the bill that was in committee, and certainly I was in favor of it. I don't think many people understand, maybe some people in this room do, and excuse me for not knowing, but I'll learn this. So the subcommittees, appropriately based on the subject matter, is where these bills come through, right? So they get heard there. If they don't make it through, it's over. So I have constituents that call me and say, why didn't you call me? I'm like, I didn't see it. It was in a subcommittee that I'm not on. And then if it dies, it's done. So what I suggest to people is if you go to the website, the General Assembly website, there's what they call lobbyist in a box. And it's free to the public, it's transparent. You can set it up and filter it accordingly based on the industries that you're interested in learning more about. And I just want to speak to that because I think a lot of people think that we see all these bills in front of us, all these, how many bills do we look at? 2,000. So if it's not in our committee or the committees that we serve, once it hits the floor, if it makes it to the floor, we don't know anything about it. And at that point, it's pretty much ready to go. We don't have input after. I mean, it's from the constituent or the lobbyist side, it's pretty much ready to go at that point for vote. So what I suggest to citizens and or business people is go to the lobbyist in box and look at that and set it up so for future reference, when you have bills coming forward, you can partake in the conversation with the delegates before they hit the floor.
If I may. So Wendy, I agree with you that the reason to shoot down something that was almost unanimously supported by the business community, particularly smaller businesses, is that Obamacare cannot tolerate competition. Businesses thrive when they're able to go out in a marketplace and find the best product that suits them the best. But the interest of the government in this case is clearly to protect the monopoly on healthcare, which really does not serve the long-term interests of the business community, and I think as well it is a disservice to the community overall. But that's why it was shot down. A really good idea, unanimously supported. I don't want to speak for every business, but that was what was communicated to me. Very enthusiastic by people like realtors and others, and the Democrat-dominated legislature said no room for competition here, only Obamacare.
Last election, there were cases of voting irregularities. Although not all actively are reported, cases, for example, here, Fairfax County had 3 massive ballot dumps. Is legislative dealing with voter integrity and restoring confidence in our voting process?
I am very glad you asked that question, whoever you are. So the Department of Elections just audited the Virginia election, and it showed that the election integrity risk measurement was 0.000065117%. That is the height of the risk of voter fraud in Virginia. This election was the fairest and the most efficiently run election that we have had in Virginia. And to think otherwise is to completely disrespect our, well, in the district I represent, 3 wonderful registrars who work so hard. We ask them to work too hard for sure, but they work so hard to maintain the integrity of our elections. And there you have it. Go look at the audit. And this audit is not done by one party. Go read how the audit was managed.
Yeah, I just wanted to honor Ms. Godice on this, and that is for the audit, should be a third party doing the audit, not the government doing the audit, being the Department of Elections. It's kind of the fox guarding the hen house, if you will. But that being said, I do think, our local registrars definitely worked hard on this past election, considering the mass turnout we had. The issues that I have, particularly with this past election, certainly are in calling question the mail-in votes, as well as the ID situation. We certainly need to have IDs for people. It needs to be an ID system. And the voting should be done on the day of the election. I don't know why we're continuing to, the voting is allowed to have mail-ins and then it gets considered a week later or 2 weeks later. It needs to be done on the day of the vote, period. And voting is not hard. You select the person gets the amount of votes, and that's the way it works. They're making something too difficult, or something too easy, too difficult. I'm not going to get into the semantics of where ones were right and where ones were wrong. I just think that the process, it needs to be stripped down to a more simple process, and it needs to be done on the day of the election.
Well, speaking of being stripped down, I protested the way Virginia's elections were handled, and it cost me my transportation committee assignment because that was an opinion that the speaker wanted to cancel. But I didn't do it lightly. I questioned it, I think, in a way that went very much to the substance of what took place on Election Day 2020. But let me start with this whitewash of a report or study. Hearing the parameters of the study with the election, or what are they, a fraud limiting audit, great name. Just like Planned Parenthood is for Planning Parenthood. You think of a good name, it can really mislead a lot of people. It examined 1,000 machines in Virginia to see if the machines were functioning. Well, that's good. The machines function. But I'll just share a couple of things that I'll be brief, but that shocked me. First off, in the special session before the election, there was a bill by Janet Howell, that proposed to amend Virginia election law in some pretty significant ways relating to ballot signatures, absentee ballot signatures, drop boxes, and so on. Drop boxes break the chain of custody. That's a pretty serious thing to do, and so on. That bill passed in the Democrat-dominated legislature, but any bill that passes the legislature doesn't go into effect for 4 months, I think it is. Well, that would have been after the election. So they decided to ignore the constitutionally required mandate for a 4-month delay. Instead, they treated it as it were appropriations law, which is enacted as soon as the governor signs the budget. So all of those changes were enacted unconstitutionally. It's clear as can be. You just have to read the Constitution, read the law, and it treated an enactment of the legislature as though it was an appropriation. So all of that was illegitimate. That involved a huge portion of the people that voted, the number of votes cast in Virginia. Another real eye-opener was that the commissioner, so if you want to commit fraud, probably the most vulnerable subset are people who have moved out of the area. So those votes aren't going to be cast, and cheaters know that. But they're still registered voters in Virginia on the rolls. So the cheaters look into that pool of voters to potentially mail absentee votes to, or just whatever form of cheating they think might be easiest. In anticipation of that, Virginia law requires the Commissioner of Elections, Chris Piper, who's ultimately responsible, to purge that annually, and to do so no less than 90 days prior to a presidential election. Well, in poking around and asking questions, we found out he issued a report, another self-serving sort of misleading report. He reported to the legislature before the election that purge was going to be done in December to comply with the law. Well, he hadn't read the law to know that December would be a few months too late. And so it would not comply with the law. It didn't take place until January following the election. So this whole block of potentially tens of thousands of voters, maybe way more than that, were left on the voter rolls in violation of Virginia law. So this is the level of credibility of the reporting that comes out of the Virginia Department of Elections. You basically have the Fox saying, all's cool in the hen house, nothing to worry about here, move along. But that's very serious stuff. The vote is a very precious thing, and we need to be making sure that every vote cast legitimately is counted, and that we should be doing everything we can to prevent people from voting illegitimately. In the 8 years that I've been there, several of the years I've seen bills brought forward, some of them my own, that would make nibble around the edges to improve voting integrity. They pass the legislature and they make it to the governor. And this has been 8 years of Democrat governor, and they get vetoed, period. If we don't have a supermajority to override that veto. So, they do it under the pretense that, things like voter ID. I mean, you need a voter ID or an ID to pick up your baseball tickets. Newsom cares about a voter ID when people are turning in recall Newsom signatures. But when it comes to one of the most important things you do to fulfill your civic responsibility, which is to cast a vote, there's this pretense that minorities don't have IDs, or can't show up at the polls with an ID. I'd be insulted if I was a minority and the suggestion was that I wasn't capable of functioning at that level, a level where I could bring an ID and fulfill my civic responsibility. At some point, you have to think, when there's so many efforts to allow cheating, that the goal of people who resist efforts to clean things up and tighten things up want people to cheat. That's the conclusion I come to. But it happens year after year after year, and people deserve better. They really deserve better. 2020. I hope we never see that happen again. Yep.
So the Department of Elections did not do the audit themselves alone. They did it collaborating with a third party, a nonprofit organization that helps conduct risk limiting audits. So it was not all government.
Are there any other questions for the floor?
Where do we see the results of that? Where will we go to find them? Look at that up.
Department of Elections, and I forget what it was called. Hang on, let me see if I wrote that down. Well, anyway, I know it would be on the website there. Yeah.
Question from a business standpoint, as far as executive orders and authority, as a small business person, feels like you're out there kind of in the wind, no protection from clients, non-compliance, it's very confusing to understand, what all the mandates and orders and actions are, especially if you don't have staff to find staff to figure this stuff out. Do you guys are starting to talk about, I think that was fun. How do you limit that government action, but what protections are you looking to institute for businesses? They're doing everything they can to try to comply with, in my opinion, overreach of executive authority, or maybe come up short, even to this efforts. What protections do we have to still be able to operate our business and these taxes, which, you know, but we are out there and win because there's no protection. There's been no talk of, you gotta look out for these guys. They want to keep their business open, keep their employees employed, keep them off. Yeah. Clients come to the health department, somebody was coming out business when they say, you're not compliant, I'm shutting you down. Wondering what action can be done by the legislature that they talk about to protect us.
I would say, first of all, there's been very, very little in terms of, what am I trying to say? In terms of enforcement, there's been very little harsh enforcement on this. There are only a couple of cases, I think, where a business has refused and refused and refused, been warned and warned and warned. So I think the issue of protection is not a huge one because there's a lot of leeway given with the compliance. And, you know, with the money in the budget for small businesses to help them rebuild, I think that, and hopefully we'll soon be on the upswing for this, but if there is any effort made at compliance, I don't think you need to worry.
So, Bill is motioning me. So I think what that amounted to is there are laws and there's a threat of serious penalties, but you probably won't have somebody come in your door and enforce them. I don't know that I don't think that's a good way to run a business. Businesses like consistency. And look, I'll just get right to the point since we're winding down here. If you want consistency and you want bills that are written by people that perhaps have been in business, that understand business and respect business and respect individual rights, then your opportunity is this election day, period. It will not happen. There's too many different things, you know, it's such a long list. We can criticize the executive orders, how they were administered, who's enforcing them, who's not enforcing them. But if people that have signed the back of the paycheck aren't making the decisions, then the decisions are going to be made by career bureaucrats, people that have not been in that position. And that's the bottom line of it. And I'll just take you there because that's the reality of it. You need to have people that understand and respect business and that care about and respect a business's freedom to operate and thrive in the community. So what do you add to that,
Yeah, I
Bill?
just want to agree with that and also state that, you know, from my position, businesses come first. And we should do everything in our power to support businesses. Because from there, when I was on council, that we keep increasing costs, but nobody's worrying about the revenue. Well, the revenue is coming. It's coming from many other small businesses. So unless we can help promote those businesses, we can't take care of the costs that keep going up. I would like to take care of people. I'd like to take care of a lot of other services in the state. But until we can get our hands around understanding that unless we help out the businesses, unless we keep unions out, unless we try to promote ways we can provide economic opportunities to government off their back so that they can make money to drive revenue for the state. So the less bureaucracy that we have to affect you can be better. That's important to me. It's important to everybody in the state.
Full disclosure, daughter of 2 union members.
If I can just have 10 seconds. Thank you, Wendy, for correcting me on the study. I did want to point out that the study that has convinced Wendy, Delegate Goditis, that elections were conducted in 100% a straightforward manner. I think I said 1,000 voting machines. Out of 4.3 million votes cast in Virginia, this audit checked 1,000 votes. So if you think that is absolutely conclusive proof that there was no mischief, I just wanted to put the numbers in front of you.
Any other questions? Delegates, would you like to have a closing word?
I would like to say, so philosophically, it seems to me, yes, there's unbelievable division in this country right now. And in the Commonwealth, yes, we had a Republican-controlled legislature for years. And yes, now it is under Democrat control, and we will see what happens after this. But it seems to me, and this is just me talking, I'm not representing anybody, but we watch the pendulum swing. And so for some number of years, the pendulum swings this way, and now it's swinging that way. And I know Delegate Wiley just said business is first. It's certainly an understandable philosophy and point of view, absolutely. But I would say people first. So for me, that means, you know, the healthcare, the ability to afford to eat, to afford to pay rent, and to afford to raise a family. And so in my view, the pendulum is swinging. It's just swinging. The day will come when it will swing the other way. I hope that there will be an ideal time in this Commonwealth, in this country, when the pendulum can just stay still and be in the middle and everything is satisfied. People are able to eat and pay rent and get their children educated. Businesses are able to run profitably and pay their employees. And, you know, maybe we'll approach that day, but we're not there yet. So to me, it's a pendulum swing, and that's my philosophy. And we will see what happens in the Commonwealth.
Delegate Wiley.
Yeah, so, you know, there's probably 2 or 3, you know, you'll learn when you see it. I would say that one thing that really disturbs me, speaking specifically to our district and to other related rural districts, is that there's a predominant amount of bills that are pushing benefit. Granted, it's understandable because where a lot of the majority is located are in cities, urban areas, and we're more considered rural areas. A lot of the bills were getting pushed to benefit the urban areas. Tax structure, the energy efficient type bills, which, you know, certainly we're going that direction, but I mean, economies of scale, those numbers don't work for us either. We can't afford to ask people in the meeting the other day. I said, how many people in this room? How many people can afford this? So that's the problem we have coming up, because the mandates are coming down in the state are going to require an extra percentage of vehicles to be electric. So until those numbers come into check, we're going to be on a losing end, specifically also with construction. Buildings are going to become more energy efficient, drives costs. Who's going to pay for that? The consumer. Some people can't afford that 20%, 30% increase in the bottom line of that house. They do a smaller house or move somewhere else. Very concerned about that from our area. The second part that I saw was the criminal reform. It's not my bailiwick, certainly not a lawyer. I don't understand that business that well. Lean on a lot of my caucus members who are. The statement that was resounding to me and concerned me tremendously is that the ones that have been in the legal world for quite some time, very tenured to do, stated that the criminal reforms that were put into play, very similar to the ones in the 1970s. The crime rate went through the roof and they had to come back and fix it. I'm very concerned about our judicial system, our law enforcement, and how things go into play with these new criminal reform laws. And last, you know, I'll keep beating the drum on this with the union world, your daughters. But I am deeply concerned. I can't stress it enough. I'm in favor of the small business. Leave them alone. Let them do what they can do so they can be successful. Union world, all it does is drive costs, guys. It's going to cost money to pay those people, decrease labor, keep up with it, paying for their overhead, and it's all going to roll downhill to the consumer. And I can't see this enough, and I'm very concerned about that.
Well, it's springtime. How could you not have an optimistic outlook? We have an election coming up. I think 15 of the Democrat delegates have challengers. Do you think that's maybe because more moderate people want to move into those seats? The opposite. They want to replace the Democrats that have been around for a while and aren't ones who aren't radical enough. That amazes me, but that's kind of where things are headed. There's a lot of good Republican candidates. And I think that, the pendulum is a good analogy. It brings to mind the picture of a wrecking ball, but I'll just leave it alone. We want that pendulum to move back in the right direction. It's not just a function of gravity and time. It's where voters choose to move the pendulum. May happen that the House goes back into the majority and slows things down, may take the governor's seat, who knows? But it's the people in this room that are going to control how far that pendulum goes in November. And if you think we can take another 2 years of what we've experienced here for the last 2 years, then, sit it out. But if you think that's impacting your business enough that you want to get in the game, I wouldn't sit it out. I don't recommend it at all. It's just too important. And at some point, especially when the integrity of the vote is on the line, you see what's happening in Washington. They want to take over states' rights to control their elections. That's very fundamental. And it's not because they want fair outcomes to the election. I guarantee you that. So kind of got to get in the game. If we want to see that brighter, that light at the end of the tunnel, it's not a spectator sport. So appreciate Wendy, serving the interests of the communities that she does, whether we agree or not. I respect anybody that serves. I'm glad to be getting better acquainted with Bill. Seemed to be hitting it off well, and it's a contest. They call it a blood sport without the sport. So we'll see how it turns out.
I'd like to thank all three delegates for being here today. Thank you, everybody here in the room. Give them all a round of applause. And that concludes our session today. Thank you.